says, my name is Randy Reppin, and I'm a professor of applied linguistics at Northern Arizona University. And so I always have to do this. Northern Arizona is not a desert. It's actually in the mountains, and we're supposed to have snow on Thursday. So just to get that out of the way. I am a corpus linguist by training, and I've been teaching for over 25 years. We don't want to talk about how many over 25 years that is, but I've been teaching ESL and training teachers for a long time, and I've also served as an IEP director for 11 years. So that's a little bit of who I am. And I'd like us to think about, today we're going to be talking about integrating grammar across skill levels. And I think this quote by Diane Larson Freeman, which I'm going to read to you, even though I know you can read it. Teaching grammar means enabling language students to use linguistic forms accurately, meaningfully, and appropriately. And I think this is really important for us, especially those of us who teach grammar in isolation, in the sense that we have a dedicated grammar course. So we're not teaching grammar in reading or grammar in writing or listening and speaking, but we're actually teaching a grammar class. I think sometimes it's easy for us to then be siloed and forget about integrating those skills. So I hope to be able to give you some ideas today that will help you integrate grammar across different skills, and then also a little bit of a surprise at the end. So as we look at this picture, we see people using language. They're listening, they're speaking, some of them are reading, maybe somebody has a computer somewhere. And we look at this, and this is a very informal language setting in most cases, although the fellow who's on the right-hand side of the screen looks like he might be reading something pretty dense. But all of these people are using grammar as they listen and read and speak. As we look at this example, though, we see, yes, these people are still using language. They're listening, and some of them look a little stressed, as computers can do that. But what I want to point out is that the type of language, this is a much more formal context than just hanging out and chatting with your friends. And that's something that grammar plays an intimate role in. And so in addition to thinking about, listening, speaking, reading, writing, we also have to think about the context in which we are doing these activities. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you four I'm going to give you four activities that I think in some ways are quite versatile. And the first one is the most versatile. And in this first one, we're going to see throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about all these four skills, although as my students know, I also think of vocabulary and grammar as part of the skills. We're going to talk about ways to combine these four skills. And this first activity that I'm going to show to you combines all of these classic four skills: reading, writing, speaking, listening. And it's, I think, one of the most versatile and useful and motivating activities. And when you see it, you're going to think, what? So this is it. It's a simple, basically a tic-tac-toe board that you could put up on a whiteboard, or you can have students draw this on their papers. They can make the board. In this example, I'm using some information from corpus research, knowing that these are the 15 most common verbs. And I could do this activity in several different ways, depending on what we've been covering in my class. I might have one of my students come up and give the instructions, so they would be speaking in a more formal manner. Their peers, their classmates, would be listening as the students use some of these verbs to complete the tic-tac-toe board, or this game board here. And then you would call out the verbs, and students could mark, and when they get 3 in a row, as you know, horizontal, vertical, or diagonal, they'd shout, bingo, or tic-tac-toe, or you're the best teacher in the world, whatever you want them to shout. And as they do this, they're getting listening input, they're reading, and then when one of them wins, they have to speak to give how they won. Now, you might look at this and think, well, they're just copying the words into there, but this is a very flexible activity. So you could set it up where maybe you've been talking about subject-verb agreement. You could ask your students to put these verbs in all at first person singular. So they would have to be saying has and does and says into the boxes. Or you could have it be where they're having to inflect these verbs for past tense. This is also an activity that you can do at a very low level. You could do this at the level of letter recognition or vocabulary practice, or you could do it at a higher level where you're actually putting chunks of language into the box. So I think this is a very easy activity that definitely integrates skills. It also is low resource. You don't need to have fancy computers or something. And it's motivating. Students like a little bit of that competitive atmosphere. At least the students that I've taught over the years certainly do. And it kind of energizes the classroom. So I wanted to show you this activity because I think that it's one of the most versatile and one of my favorite activities. The next activity that I want to talk about is not one that's as easily adapted to different levels, but it involves students reading and talking. And so obviously, if they're talking, they're also listening. And in this example, I'm going to show you a text. And the reason I picked this text, now this would work probably for a high intermediate to advanced level. This is a nice short text. It's about Jamaican English. It's about English and how different dialects of English, such as American English and British English, use different words, but also how American and British English have impacted other countries. And in this case, it's looking at Jamaica. And I think this is nice because it raises our students' awareness about language and how language impacts us. There also, if you look at this reading, you can see that there's some grammar structures in here. So, there's the example from people saying, do you have versus have you got? You can talk about how these perform the same function, but they're different. We can talk about how English influences languages. And I think it just gives students a chance to talk about the impact of English on their language. And you can have a debate whether that's positive or negative, of course. But it allows students to bring in something that they are experts. They are experts in their own language. And so here they are in a language classroom and perhaps struggling. And so it's really nice for them to sort of have that confidence booster and also to be able to share with each other, especially if you have a heterogeneous classroom. That can be a really nice way to bring talking about language, talking about students, their cultures, and allowing them to be experts for a few minutes or even longer. This next activity is actually a sequence of activities. And I think that it's a really important, it's an important activity because so many times as teachers, we're fluent users of English and we can modify our language use very easily according to different contexts of use. So if you think back to the first towards the beginning when I showed you the slide of the people in the coffee shop. So those people were definitely using informal language. And many times our students, some of them have come because of media, social media, internet, TV, YouTube. They come to our classrooms with some knowledge of informal English. And many times they don't realize that there's a need to have, in a sense, another type of English. And that's what I mean by register awareness. So register is just, I'm using that as a cover term for context of language use. And that is a functional thing that drives what we have, what we do use, the linguistic resources that we use. So I want to show you, this sounds really complicated, but believe me, it's not. Let me show you this activity, and I think you'll see what a nice activity it is to have a sequence of skills, but also to sort of raise awareness about different contexts of language use. So you're going to start with a listening and writing activity. And one of the things that I know in my English language teaching, I've always tried to help students be more effective and efficient note takers, because when they're out of our ESL classrooms or EFL classrooms, they're going to have to take notes in their classes. And so I think it's a really useful activity to give students practice with this. And a grammar class, a listening class, a writing class, these are all great places to do that. So you would have a little lecture, a short lecture. Hopefully you're doing some kind of content-based instruction, and you could use a lecture from that topic. And you're going to have your students take notes on the lecture. Okay, so we have maybe 5 to 10 minutes of lecture, and our students have taken notes. So they've been listening, and they've been even looking over their notes a little bit. The next sequence is they're going to start reading, speaking, and writing. So after the students have taken their notes, they're going to buddy up with another student. They're going to have a partner, and they're going to read their notes to each other, talk about them. So they're looking at language, talking about language, and they might see, oh, wow, you wrote this down, but I didn't write that down. Do you think that's an important point? So here they are talking about the content, talking about the need to be responsible for content, but using language to do that. Then they're going to fill in the missing pieces, because we know when we take notes, we delete a lot of those function words. We might use arrows instead of, transition words. And so here's an example of taking something that we've listened to, we've written it down in a note-taking format, and now we're going to take those sort of, that skeleton, and we're going to flesh it out, and we're going to produce a written text. And so students have listened, they've written, they've talked, they've listened and spoken, right? And then they've written a little text together, and then they can compare their text with other partners, kind of the classic pair share thing. And as they're doing this, they might notice that other students have structured the text differently. So I think it's a really rich and useful activity to do this, to help students understand how to move from what happens in note-taking to what happens in writing, because oftentimes we'll lecture on something and then we'll ask our students in an exam situation or in a test, we might ask them to write about something that they have notes on. And they need to understand that just putting those notes back onto the paper is not going to be adequate, that they have to turn it into a text. And you could actually start talking about some of the grammatical features that have been left out of the text, that left out of the notes, and that need to be put back in as the notes become a text. So another thing that I think is really important is this notion of graphs. Graphs and tables and charts are something that most of our students are going to be expected to manage. They're going to have to be able to read them, they're going to have to produce them, and they're going to have to be able to write about them. And this is probably at an advanced level, but I think it can also be simplified. So we have some special vocabulary, and so we would want to pre-teach this vocabulary that we use in graphs, tables, and charts. And so I don't know if this is as clear for you as it could be, but I'm sure that the Cambridge people can do their magic. Um, so we see certain verbs like, the graph shows or the chart shows. We have language to show a change in a graph. So this is part of grammar, and it's learning how to talk about graphs. And now we're going to look at a graph activity that still, even though it's a graph activity, is going to integrate the skills into the grammar. So in this case, the students are listening to a short excerpt of speech, and they're having to complete the graph that you see here. And then after they complete the graph, they're going to talk to a partner and they're going to describe the graph, and then I would have them write about the graph. So we've got listening, we've got speaking, and we've got reading. And this, you can see how this builds. It's not just we're throwing the students into there. We've talked about the vocabulary they're going to need, and then we've practiced that vocabulary. So obviously this wouldn't happen as quickly as it did in this, few minute lecture. So they're listening, they're having to listen for details. So it's not listening for the gist. They're putting that information on the graph, then they're talking to a classmate, and then they're individually writing about it. So this integrates all those skills and gives them practice with something that's very important. So in these previous 4 exercises or activities, they were taking multiple skills and integrating them into grammar, or taking a grammar idea or an area of grammatical practice and integrating skills into that. What I now want us to think about is taking multiple tasks and integrating multiple aspects of grammar into that. So it's sort of, in a sense, the other side of a coin. So when we think about the types of tasks that our students will need to be able to do to be successful in an academic environment for sure, but also even in a non-academic environment, students will be telling stories or explaining things. They'll have a problem and have to figure out a solution. They'll need to persuade people. So these tasks came about as research that was done, and we collected writing from private colleges, community colleges, and universities to see what types of writing tasks students typically did. And these were 6 of the tasks that repeatedly came up. So as we look at these tasks, I think we often think about grammar and we tend to cover grammar as a single topic. We might spend a class period on present perfect, or we might spend a class period looking at passive voice. So here, what I want us to think about is looking at, say, cause and effect, and looking at how we can use suites of grammar, and how we do use suites of grammar to accomplish that. So when we're doing something with cause and effect, we have certain nouns that we're using. We use certain transition words that show effect. We have subordinators and prepositions, and all of these grammar features work together like a fine-tuned machine to help us write a cause and effect paper. Or if you think about problem solution, if we look at the types of features that are present in problem solution writing, we'll notice that we use, perfect, present perfect, and present perfect progressive together. And I think this is important for us. We've talked about integrating skills, but I think it's also important to realize how to integrate grammar to accomplish a specific task. So I hope that by looking at these activities, the 4 activities that integrated skills, that you have some things that you can bring into your classroom and help your students see how grammar does really work as a function of language and not something we just drill in the abstract, and how we can kind of scaffold that to go from very controlled to more open-ended practice. I hope that you also see how grammar works together to create texts. And this is just obviously a table of contents, so you're not seeing the examples, but you could. So we've looked at these ways, and I want to end our little seminar, our little